So who knows? But it's not an objection that to me holds a whole lot of water. Any questions or comments at this point? So, another major objection against the letter of James is the fact that this is one of the last books to be included in the New Testament canon. Now, canon is simply a word that means measuring rod. And the idea here is to go around and look at various writings that were available to them at that time and try to figure out which ones of these things could have been inspired, which ones were frauds or what have you. And this whole issue of canon was actually forced on the church by the Gnostics. Now, little perspective here. If you recall early on in the church when the gospel began to be spread amongst Gentiles, a lot of Jews were kind of uncomfortable with that. And so what did they say? So we need to take these Gentile Christians and circumcise them and teach them to keep the law of Moses. Well, why did they say that? Because they were Jews. They had been circumcised, they had kept the law of Moses, and they kind of wanted to make that part of Christianity as well. And of course, in Acts chapter 15, we have the big conference, and they basically come to the conclusion, we're not going to do that. No, by the way, in Acts chapter 15, James, the brother of our Lord and the writer of this letter, is a very prominent figure in that chapter in helping them come to an understanding of what they need to do. The Gnostics are the Greek version of this thing. The Greeks are the intellectuals of the ancient world. Gnostic is from the Greek word knowledge, and so what the Gnostics taught was a merging of Platonic philosophy with mysticism and things like that, and so it was a very knowledge-based form of salvation, and that's kind of their import to it. And the other thing that was kind of interesting about those guys, or unfortunately interesting about those guys, they were really prolific writers. And so they're spewing out all of these things, the Gospel of Thomas and all these other types of writings and things like that, and early church fathers are trying to figure out, well, what's real, what's not here. And so we come up with the idea of canon, and what is, what isn't, and how you measure it. And the only real issue for James is that the letter was not as widely circulated as the other letters of Paul, or the other letters of the New Testament, particularly Paul, the gospel accounts and things like that. And so it's not canonized until later. Another couple of letters that fall into this category are 1st and 2nd Peter. Not widely circulated, fall into this category. But eventually, they're added to the canon later, and the fact that they're added later doesn't suggest that they weren't authentic. It just means they weren't widely circulated. So not a really good argument about that. Then finally, there are the famous objections to the letter of James. This, some writers and commentators, and particularly in early times as well, I mean, this is almost a 2,000-year thing by this particular point, have seen the letter of James as a direct contradiction to Paul's teachings, especially in the letter of Romans. Now, faith in Romans is a very important topic. And Paul kind of emphasizes faith first. Faith as a motivation, and that's true, it should be. And then when we read the book of James, he's going to tell us, show me your faith apart from your works. I will show you my faith by my works. So what's the difference here? Why are we in disagreement on this thing? The famous Reformation teacher Martin Luther originally believed that James was not canon and had difficulty accepting it as a part of the New Testament, and he referred to it as the straw epistle. Now, in Martin Luther's favor, remember the time frame he's writing in. What's going on in the Roman Catholic Church at that particular time that he's trying to reform? A works-based system where if you sin and you go to confession, they're going to tell you to do penance. This is how you're going to work off the sin that you've committed. Well, what happens if you don't want to wait to get to confession? You kind of want to plan ahead for the sin that you're going to commit? Buy an indulgence. That's exactly right. Can you imagine how that will be with modern American marketing? We have a BOGO this week. Buy one, get one free on adultery. Yeah, sign me up, that kind of a thing. And so what are you doing there? In both cases, you're working off your own sin, either after the fact in the penance or before the fact in the indulgence. Did you know it's not our responsibility to pay for our sins? It's not. Our job in dealing with sin is to repent, isn't it? Let's clean up our act and try to work through these things and become more like Christ, but we don't pay for our sins. And so that's the culture that Martin Luther's in, and so that may be one of the reasons he had trouble with this particular letter. But he did eventually come to the conclusion that James was actually legitimate, that it was a good, inspired letter. Now, so what about getting back to now, what's the difference between the way that Paul is looking at faith in Romans versus the way that James is going to look at faith in his letter? Well, the author of the Barnes Notes commentary on James, I don't know the guy's name. It might have actually been Albert Barnes, but it's kind of a cover name that they had different people write for. He suggested that faith is being seen from two different points of view here. In Romans, Paul is looking at faith from the point of view of the unconverted. And that makes sense, doesn't it, from the unconverted? What do you need to do to be saved? You kind of have to know who God is. You kind of have to know who Jesus is. You kind of have to have an understanding of what the plan is, and then you have to decide whether or not you're going to believe it. Excuse me. Paul shows that all have sinned and that good works, flawed obedience, rites of ceremony, birth, lineage, or any of these other things that we might want to save us or give us value in ourselves are insufficient for the need. It's got to be Christ. And if you believe that, you do something about it, don't you? So your faith is actually going to start doing something once it gets to that particular point. In James, the writer is looking at faith from the point of view of the converted or the Christian here. And what's the difference? James argues that if faith is present, then it will be seen by the fruit that it bears. How do you know the tree? If it's an apple tree, what does it bear? It bears apples. If it's a plum tree, it bears plums. And so that's, so faith is the same way. It bears a certain kind of a particular fruit. And that's what James is going to argue. So who's right? Paul or James? Yes. Yes is the answer to that question. Both are right. I've never heard of anybody who's come forward and said, you know what? I don't believe in God. I don't believe in Jesus. I don't believe a word that you're saying, but just on the 1 in a zillion chance that you're going to be right, I want to be baptized for the remission of my sins. Not a real candidate for baptism, is it? And when things start to get a little bit sticky or inconvenient, guess who's going to be the first one not there? So, we understand this. You do this because you believe, and because you believe, you do some other things as well. And that's really the difference in emphasis between the two writings. Questions or comments? Okay, time of writing. Commentators have suggested a date of writing for this letter ranging from 45 to 60 AD. Historically, this is an important time period in the history of the church, in large part because the church has become large enough to be perceived to be a threat to Jewish, Greek, and Roman ways of life. Particularly this decade from 50 to 60 AD is really important in church history. If you think back, 50 AD, the church has been around for about 20 years now, about 30 years by the time we get to 60 AD. It's not the only thing brewing in the Roman Empire. We're working our way towards this big Jewish rebellion as well. And so, based on my own research, I favor a date closer to 60 AD rather than an earlier date. And if you're wanting to know what that research was, well, I'm going to share it with you. So, I did some research on this particular time period, and I believe in empathy, human empathy, the kind of thing that says, if you're rejoicing, I know what that feels like, I can rejoice with you. If you're in sorrow, I know what that feels like, I can share your sorrow. Reverse empathy is, I thought this was really interesting stuff, therefore you think this is really interesting stuff. So, okay. So looking at this particular decade, the population of the Roman Empire is estimated to be about 50 million people. We don't like we don't really think in terms of that. That's a lot of people in the ancient world. That is 15.2% of the total U.S. population of 330 million in the 2020 census. And according to the U.S. Census, this is equivalent to the population of California, which is our largest state at 50 million, plus the state of Georgia, which is our 11th state at 10 million. There are a lot of people in California. There's a lot of people in the Roman Empire. As many as 1/3 of the population of the Roman Empire was slaves. Europe itself in the Dark Ages did not achieve the population of the Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd century until the 15th century or the early Renaissance period. So that's how advanced this society was, that they were bigger than the rest of Europe for millennia. This is a pretty sophisticated ancient society. Major events in the Roman Empire. In 41 AD, Claudius becomes emperor of Rome following the assassination of Caligula by the Praetorian Guard. Hold on to that thought because I want to talk about it a little bit more later. In 44 AD, Judea becomes a Roman province against its will following the death of Herod Agrippa. This is the same Herod Agrippa in Acts chapter 2 that Luke describes his death. Prior to this, Rome was not a full-scale province in the Roman Empire. After this guy dies, Rome decides you're going to be a full-scale province in the Roman Empire. And what does that mean? That means you are going to take Roman names, speak Latin, and you're going to adopt Roman customs and the Roman religion. Now, if you are a student of the history between the Testaments and you think back to the time of the Greeks, the Seleucid Empire, when Antiochus Epiphanes came down to Judea and he says, you're going to be Greek citizens, you're going to speak the Greek language, you're going to follow Greek customs, and you're going to worship Greek gods. What happened? They rebelled. The Maccabean rebellion occurred, and they rebelled, and they actually won. So when Rome comes in here in 44 AD and says the exact same thing, history shows this isn't going to end well. So that's kind of the root of the problem that goes along with that particular thing. 49 AD, Claudius expelled all Jews from Rome. That's actually mentioned in the New Testament. I think Luke writes about it or mentions it. In 50 AD, Claudius adopted Nero as his heir. In 54 AD, Claudius died and Nero ascended to the throne. 64 AD, the city of Rome caught fire, and in 68 AD, a revolt erupted in Rome and Nero committed suicide. Any name on that list stand out to you as a student of the biblical history? Nero. Yeah, Nero's not a good thing in the 1st century. The burning of Rome. The big event that triggered a lot of what's going to happen to the church in this particular time period is that in 64 AD, a fire destroyed a large portion of this, of the city of Rome. And there was much speculation that the fire had been started by Nero. And when I say much speculation, it's almost conclusive that Rome, or Nero, set fire to a part of Rome where he wanted to burn out a bunch of people to build this big, massive, huge palace unlike anything any other Caesar had ever had or would be likely to have after that particular time period. And it got out of hand. Even though you think of an ancient city as being made mostly of stone, there's a lot of wood and thatch and things on the roofs and things like that in the more common houses. And what happens when they start burning? It's a firestorm. It's a firestorm, pure and simple. And so that's kind of what happened here. Now, Nero has burned the city to the ground practically. And people are saying, why did you burn the city to the ground? And so he needs a scapegoat. He needs somebody to blame. And here's this group of people, these Christians, they eat human flesh and they drink blood and they're doing all kinds of weird things and they're not very Roman and things like that. They're the ones that burned the city down, and so he began to persecute them violently. So that's what's coming ahead. Now, periods of persecution of Christians by Roman authorities would continue for at least 3 centuries after this thing. So it won't be like 300 years consistently. It will be in bursts and periods and things like that. where somebody was going to come to the throne and say, these guys are weird, we need to do something to get them in line with the general Roman program or whatever it was that they wanted. So but this is the first here where we have official Roman persecution falling down on the Christians. Questions or comments? Yes? So the question is, were the Jews being lumped in with the Christians when they were being persecuted? And the answer is no. The Christians were being lumped in with the Jews during a lot of this persecution. From the Roman perspective, Christianity and Judaism were two sects of the same God. And the Jews being the older sect, having been around longer and being more numerous, the Christians would have been seen as the rival or the subsect of the Jews. So they're going to persecute them both. The Jews because they're rebellion, and the Christians because, well, they're kind of Jewish and, you know, we need a scapegoat. But so they do it a little bit differently in some cases, at least at first. And later on, as Christians become more numerous, they will start to see a distinction between the two. Okay, thanks. Appreciate that. Claudius. Claudius came to the throne in 41 AD as the Praetorian Guard assassinated his predecessor, Caligula. Caligula was a piece of work. Yeah. Reigned 4 years. There's been speculation he might have been mentally ill or something like that or anything like that. But the bottom line is, how many of you have ever heard the phrase, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely? Nero's the poster child for that phrase. He came into the throne and he was extremely self-indulgent. He was extremely vicious against his foes or anybody that dared to oppose him. He inherited from his predecessor, Augustus Caesar, a fairly healthy Roman Empire with a large budget, you know, a large storehouse of money and things like that. He spent it all in 4 years on his own pleasures and indulgences. He built lakes, he built pleasure barges, anything that pleased his senses, he went after it. And so his Praetorian Guard assassinated him. Now put this in perspective. The Praetorian Guard was the Roman equivalent of the United States Secret Service. Their only job was to protect the emperor. Now, the Secret Service actually has other jobs. I think a lot of the things that they do for the Treasury departments, like counterfeiting and things like that, but their job is to protect the president. How bad do you have to be when your own guards, whose only responsibility is to protect you, say, this guy's got to go? The Praetorian Guard, well, this is the first time they're going to assassinate a Roman emperor. It's not the last time in Roman history. You get a rotten empire, the Praetorian Guard says, we're done, you're done. So the Praetorian Guard selected Claudius to be the next emperor. There was a bit of argument about that. And they basically told the Senate, well, put your own guy on there. We know how to work this out. And so they said, yeah, we'll go with your guy for a while here. Claudius suffered several birth defects, probably due to inbreeding. This was a very famous thing that happens a lot in royal houses and noble houses because you want to keep the bloodline pure, so you marry close cousins and things like that because you know that the bloodline is pure. And surprise, there's genetic difficulties that comes about it. More modern example, European monarchies in the late 1800s, 1870s to 1900, hemophilia was rampant through all the royal houses of Europe because of an inbreeding problem. So Claudius had some of these issues, didn't speak well, probably may have had some visual issues and things like that. And he was regarded as insignificant by everyone of political importance. The social influencers, all that kind of thing. Claudius ain't nothing. Well, now he's emperor. He was often publicly dismissed prior to becoming emperor or portrayed as a drooling idiot. Claudius' most notable military success was the reconquest of Britain. This also becomes a hallmark of Roman emperors. If you want to lay a claim to the throne or be successful as an emperor, you got to go out and conquer something. And if you can't do that, your reign is going to be short. This was his. Claudius was married 4 times. The first 2 marriages ended in divorce. His third wife was a 15-year-old girl named Valeria Messalina, historically reputed to have used her sexuality to advance her own sex interest, her own self-interest, because people have never done this before in human history or afterwards. The official term that was used in Rome to describe her was a court nymphomaniac. So, some things never change with humanity, do they? She bore 2 children and later ran off with this consul Silius, and Claudius eventually hunted her down and had her executed. Claudius then married Agrippina, sister of Caligula, and his own niece. So the inbreeding thing is not going away anytime soon, in this type of relationship, or this type of arranged relationship. Agrippina came into the marriage with a son named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. That's 10 syllables, people. Who hangs a 10-syllable name on your own kid? There it is. He was 4 years older than Claudius' son and heir Britannicus, named for the conquest of Britain. Agrippina convinced Claudius to name her son heir to the Roman throne, and then when Claudius died, he assumed throne under the name of Nero. Nero was also a piece of work. He had an incestuous relationship with his own mother and decided that she was just trying to control him, so he had her killed. He had a whole mess of other people killed, big martyrdom of Christians and things like that, just a real hard case to get along with. A notable thing about both Caligula and Nero is most Roman historians, with most emperors, you can usually find a historian that will say something at least good about even the bad emperors. Kind of an apologetics thing, well, maybe it wasn't their fault, they were sick or something like that. Nobody says that about Nero or Caligula. Not real popular guys in history. Another thing that's probably a little bit more important to us is the spread of the gospel in this particular time period. Well, the mission of the church has always been to spread the gospel, and the early church did this with a passion. They were taking the message everywhere. Sometimes it was triggered by persecution, and they would pick up from this place and go find someplace else, and the first thing they would do when they got there is spread the gospel. And even though the New Testament does not record all the ways that the gospel was spreading or who carried the actual message, it spread quickly through the ancient world and was noticed by the Roman Empire. So 50 AD is only 20 years after the establishment of the church. And by the late 40s, some Roman writers and influencers began to describe Christianity as the plague of the countryside. So there's kind of a, step number one when you're going to get hostile with somebody is you have to find out a reason. You have to find a way to characterize them for this to justify the action that you're about to take on them. There's the starting point right there. This is the plague. These people with their weird rules and their weird religion, they only believe in one God. When you have all of these others to choose from, why would you do something that way? Why aren't they good Romans? That kind of a thing. And they're all over the place out in the countryside. Haven't invested maybe in the cities quite as much as they would like, but they're all over the place everywhere else. And so at some point we're going to have to do something about this. Tensions between Jews and Christians began to increase in the late 40s, and they've always been there, haven't they? You go back and you look at who were the first persecutors of the church? The Jews were, yeah. It was a very regional thing. It was pretty much strictly Palestine until Paul goes out on his missionary journeys, and then, when first place he wants to go, synagogues. Who's the first people that reject him when he gets there? The Jews. So that kind of a thing is going on there as well. So, but tensions between the Romans and the Christians also start to increase about this time as well. The increase in pressure on the Jews as a result of this decision that they were going to become a Roman province made in 44 AD was that the Jews got into open rebellion against the Roman Empire, and this led to the siege of Jerusalem in 67 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So that's the short version of how that history all played out. In the book of Acts, Paul is the most prominent apostle in spreading the gospel throughout the empire. Peter and John and some others are mentioned early on in the book of Acts, but they're more focused on Palestine. Paul's the guy who's taken the message throughout the empire, so he's going to be a notable figure as well. Paul's mission trips. these are approximate dates, as best anybody can, hang a date on a thing. 47, 48 AD, first missionary journey with Barnabas to Cyprus and Galatia. 49 AD, council at Jerusalem, where they had this problem crop up. Jewish Christians saying, we need to circumcise them, keep the law of Moses, and they kind of work through that thing. James is an important figure in this thing. Paul is, Peter is as well. And 49 through 52 AD, this is the second missionary journey of Paul with Silas through Asia Minor and Greece. A little bit of frustration in there because he keeps trying to go places and he keeps getting blocked, and he finally figures out, we got to go to Greece. We got to go to Macedonia and spread the gospel there. During this time, he spent about 18 months in Corinth, and he writes the letters to the Thessalonians. 52 AD, visits Jerusalem and Antioch, and then goes off on his third missionary journey. He spends a large portion of the third missionary journey at Ephesus. So if you recall, when he's returning at the end of the second missionary journey, he passed through there, and he said, if God wills, I'll come back here. And he did. So he works out of there. He travels then, after leaving Ephesus, through Greece and possibly Illyricum, and he writes the letter to the Romans. So very active in this thing. Kind of nice to look at it and realize that this wasn't no fly-by-night operation. He was on the road in each of these missionary journeys for multiple years. Time's slower, but he was spending the time when he could with these congregations, helping to establish them and build them up and help them to become, what they needed to be. So 57 to 59 AD, he returns to Jerusalem. He's arrested, imprisoned at Caesarea. 59-60 AD, he's appearing before Festus and appeals to Caesar. And the Caesar that he's appealing to is Nero at this particular time. So then he sets sail for Rome. 60 to 62, he's under house arrest in Rome. He writes the prison epistles, Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon. 62 to 64, he's released. Some say he went west to Spain. Some people say he went east back to Asia, Galatia, or Crete, or something like that. But he writes letters to Timothy and Titus at the same time. And then in 64 AD, when the persecution really gets underway, he's brought back to Jerusalem and martyred during this particular persecution. There are other writers who say that it was probably closer to 67 AD, 68 AD. But this is, how does Nero know to go hunt this guy down? Because that's the Caesar he appeared before. So, need an important figure to martyr, there's your guy. The recipients of this particular letter, the intended recipients of this letter are identified by James in chapter 1, verse 1, as the 12 tribes of the dispersion. In that particular time period, this phrase was used to describe Jews living outside of Palestine. There were actually two dispersions that happened, and I'll get into that in a minute, but this has led the fact that this phrase is used to describe Jews has led some people to conclude that James was writing to Jews in general, which absolutely makes no sense, because he's talking about the works of faith, and why would you write to people who don't have that faith to discuss that topic? When we're dealing with people who are teaching them the gospel, who opens with this is the organization of the church, and this is what we do in worship and all of those kinds of things? Important topics, yes, but not in that audience, right? Who God is, who Christ is, what's been done for you, how you can believe and trust this kind of a thing. So that doesn't make any sense. Or that he's writing to Jewish Christians. More likely, James is using dispersion to remind his readers that in the world, Christians are aliens living in a foreign land. And Peter uses the same language in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. We talk where he writes to his audience as those who reside as aliens. So that's the more likely thing. And he's just using an illustration everybody would have been familiar with. We're a dispersion in that regard. So, two different dispersions. There was an Eastern dispersion and a Western dispersion. The Eastern dispersion is the result of Assyrian and Babylonian conquest that we see about in the Old Testament. Actually, the judgment events for the 10 northern tribes and then for Judah between 750 BC, 586 BC. A lot of Jews that were transported to what would really, in our geography, be modern-day Iraq, maybe eastern Iran or western Turkey, these types of things. And after they had spent 75 years or more in this situation, that was home to a lot of people, so they didn't all go back to Judah. The western dispersion was a result of the Greek conquest. It actually began with Alexander the Great in the 330s BC, and later on, when everybody's trying to curry favor with Jews, they said, come and live here. And so they settled along the trade routes in southern Turkey and Egypt there. And so that was the audience that Paul always went to first when he's out on his missionary journeys, was the Greeks or the Jews of this particular western dispersion. So, characteristics of the letter. The letter consists of short sections of discussion and practical matters. James uses a particular Hebrew writing technique where he discusses a topic in one section, and then this section is called a maxim. I think it's a Greek writing style that he's actually using here. And then he selects a word or phrase that he uses incidentally in that maxim and makes it the theme of his next section here. The letter consists of, by my count, about 9 maxims. I'm not hard counting that, so what we're going to encounter as we get into here is 9 pithy sections of this is what faith does, this is how faith reacts, and that's going to tell us, give us some ideas on proving our own faith as we're going forward. That's why the thing is written. I'm going to promise you right now the book is going to sting a little bit. Now, because none of us are going to be doing these things perfectly. I'm not worried about the stinging part. That's not the goal anyway, is to make everybody feel bad. The goal is to say, this is what faith looks like. And for us to look at it and say, yeah, I'm not really measuring up there. Maybe this is a thing that, an area that I need to serve. And we will do so. And you know why we will do so? Because faith works, doesn't it? I mean, it's a sign. We do things on faith all the time. We turn on light switches, we turn on water, and we get in our cars and go to work or not go to work or whatever it is. We do all of these things on the assumption that what I'm going to do here is going to work and be successful, don't we? And if you flip the light switch on and it doesn't work, how many of you start whining that the laws of physics in the universe are breaking down and we're all going to die? A more prudent solution is to say, oh, the bulb's burned out. Or maybe the circuit breaker's blown or something like that, but we're not going to get ourselves into a full-scale panic of it. We do this in everyday activity, and now we're going to learn how to do it in Christ. Okay. Any questions or comments before we're dismissed? Yes?
So one thing you haven't mentioned, it's kind of anecdotal, but the fact they had a postal service back then, they had the ability to send letters, it still amazes me. You think first century, second century, how they could distribute this stuff.
Yeah.
It's still kind of phenomenal to me how they advanced that, at least in the Roman Empire.
Yeah, that was one of the secrets of the Roman Empire, actually, was the fact that they had a very vibrant, well-oiled trade system throughout the whole empire. That's, in fact, how the city of Rome itself gets to be, over 1 million. Sometimes people say as many as 3 million people. You're not growing all that food in Italy. So they did have a good system there. It was a very sophisticated civilization at that particular time. So a lot of admirable things about it, a lot of not so admirable things. Okay, I appreciate your attention, and we'll be back next week, and we'll crack open the book and see how things go.